Well, I'm embarrassed to stand up here now after that wonderful introduction. All of it untrue. So, and Kobe.
Wait, your father was a banker.
He was a banker. He was. Well, I thank you very much for that introduction. And I want to thank Mitchell Smith, your director, who's a very good friend and a supporter of mine throughout our long career. We were at Princeton together and ended up at OU together for a while before he went on to greener pastures. Although I must say I spent a lot of my life in Pennsylvania because I grew up outside of Philadelphia. Now, Kurt, let me, that's where I am. Today I'm going to talk to you about three things. I'm going to talk to you, firstly, about U.S. military interventions and why they have become more frequent rather than less frequent, and what that means for the U.S. I'm going to talk to you, secondly, about regime change, our policy of regime change in the Middle East, and what that got us, and how really detrimental it has been, both for the region and for the United States. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about America's relationship with Israel and its limitations and what that means to the region. But let me begin with U.S. military power writ large. And this is derived in part from a new study by Cushing and Toft, who made a giant database and crunched the numbers. And in their numbers, the U.S. has undertaken roughly 400 military interventions since 1776, with half of these operations undertaken between 1950 and 2019, when this study ends. But the important part here is that the U.S. has increased its military use of force abroad since the end of the Cold War. And this raises a question: why would it do that? In the 44 years of the Cold War, from 1946 to 1990, 89, 90, the Soviet Union collapses, U.S. intervened 104 times, or about 2.4 times per year. Once the Soviet Union collapses, the United States, in the 30 short years since the Cold War ended, the U.S. has intervened 112 times, or about 3.7 times a year. And interestingly enough, in the post-1911 era, the threats of force decrease while actual usage of force and overwhelming force have become commonplace. So America has become more violent in its use of force. Since 1990, the U.S. has no comparator competitors, no Soviet Union. Nobody could invade the homeland. So the question then arises, why would it begin to increase its use of force and its intervention abroad where there isn't really a foreign threat that could threaten the homeland? Now, the focus of American interventions began to shift from largely Latin America to, as it became a global hegemon, it began to be more frequently the Middle East, North Africa, and to get sub-Saharan Africa. So the question is, why? Why would this be the case? Now, to some of you, I've spoken about that because we had a conversation earlier. But to those who were not there, why do you think that would be the case? Why would America intervene more frequently and with a greater use of force since the fall of the Soviet Union? What's the venture?
Oil.
What's that?
Oil.
Oil? Okay, oil could be, although today America is producing more oil than it ever has, at 12 million barrels a day. That's more than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, which are both producing about 10 million barrels a day. And we outproduce everybody. We're self-sufficient in oil today, oddly enough. Let me charge in here. A realist would say we do it because we can. Because there's no peer competitor to stomp us, we can intervene much more at will. For example, you take invasion of Iraq in 2003. Had the Soviet Union still been a power and it supported them all, we would have been much more hesitant to enter into Iraq and try to turn on the regime, because the Soviet Union might well have backed up the Iraqi army, sent them arms, or intervened directly in some way. And it could have escalated. But because there was no peer competitor, we can do it. We can overthrow Iraq. And now there are others who claim it's for path dependency, that the US's greater military capacity has created this path dependency that now entices the US to intervene further. When you have a hammer, you know that if you boil it down, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So you've got this giant military, you can solve a lot of problems through military intervention. Others point to the military-industrial complex, and they say it's much more about money, lobbying, and that there's too much money in politics. So there are pressures then to go through a military answer. But I think the realist answer here is the predominant answer. It's because America can, which would suggest, when does that begin to slow down? When would America be more reluctant to intervene?
Once the barbarian hegemony rises up.
Exactly. Once China begins to have the military capacity to intervene in the Middle East, then it'll be much less likely to intervene. If China were to come to the aid of Iran, for example, there would be less likelihood, whether it's technologically to help to build missiles or other, to build up the military, anti-aircraft, so forth, because you immediately get into an escalation competition where you wouldn't have supremacy in escalating. Okay. What does that mean? It means we've had this period of being the sole superpower, the world hegemon. And we've had from 1990 to today, and it's running out pretty quickly, of being able to really have our way on the world, and shape the world in ways that we wanted to shape. And that has led to excesses. It's led to overreach. And we're going to talk about that right now, because we're going to talk about regime change. In particular, regime change, yeah.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
So would you say that kind of the peer competitors, they just have started already a little bit? Because at least I know that one of the reasons why we don't really pursue aggressive regimes to change in Syria is because the Russians aren't big fans of
I'm going to get to that. That is very good. I'm going to get to that, and that raises the question, did Russia save Bashar al-Assad? And I'm going to argue that they did not. Okay, they participated in it, of course, but it wasn't their doing that saved them. I do think we are, we've got a short, we're not going to be able to do this for that much longer. Okay, so regime change, which we do in Afghanistan, Iraq. We think about doing in Syria. We do it in Libya, in taking out Gaddafi. Our argument is, of course, that these are tyrannical governments that oppress their people, which is true, and that we can make a better government, and we can introduce democracy into the Middle East, and this will be the fourth wave. That was the idea, the argument of the fourth wave of democracy. Democracy started in Europe, but then there had been waves in Eastern Europe with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and Latin America with the fall of dictatorships, and then the Middle East was ripe. And all America had to do was kick down the doors of a major autocracy like Iraq, and we could transform the greater Middle East. That was the line and the argument that President Bush used in a big address in London, in which he talked about transforming the greater Middle East to include Afghanistan and Iran and so forth. That by changing the government in Iraq, America would hit the dominoes, and that the Middle East would have a salutary effect, and Middle Easterns would see how successful Iraq was and all want to become like Iraq. That was the idea. That was the argument that was put forward. Of course, you are getting rid of an enemy, a pesky regime that has been a thorn in your side. And all those regimes that fall, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, were enemies. None of the authoritarian regimes that were Americans' friends were attacked. In fact, many people make that joke that democracy was too good for our friends, only for our enemies. And okay, the thing is that regime change ended up sparking civil war in every one of these countries. It did not lend itself to a power-sharing arrangement and a better government. What you've got is worse human rights record, lots of killing, and a big expense for America in each of these countries. And I want to talk to you just about two. I'm going to spend most time in Syria, as I promised you. But I want to mention Iraq, because we have an Iraqi here, Noor, who comes from the green part down in southern Iraq. And Iraq, just like Syria and Lebanon and Israel, Palestine, if you will, is a multi-religious, multi-ethnic country, which makes it hard to hold together, because all of these countries were created after World War I out of the Ottoman Empire, a multi-religious, multi-ethnic empire. And they were created haphazardly. You know, the old saying is they were created on napkins in European capitals as Europeans fought over where the borders were going to be. But there were no good borders to draw in these empires. In the same way that Central Europe, when you're dismantling the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there were no good neighbors to draw. You were going to put people together in one country that didn't necessarily want to live together. And you ask them to find a common national identity. And in almost every one of the class of 1919, the countries, the 9 nation states that were created in Eastern and Central Europe at the Paris Peace Conference, and the Middle Eastern countries, they all failed spectacularly. From Poland right down to Palestine. This long string of new nation states that were created on multi-ethnic empires after World War I all failed. And you get World War II, you get ethnic cleansing in Europe between 1944 and 1950, 31 million people are ethnically cleansed in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, right down, even little places like Crimea. Because this great sorting out goes on with too many different ethnic groups over who's going to dominate. And it's a zero-sum game for minorities. Iraq follows that pattern. In the south here, you have the green areas, you have the Shiites. In the yellow, you've got Sunni Arabs. They're 20% of the population. Shiites 60%, Kurds 20%. Kurds are a different ethnic group. Shiites and Sunnis are both Arab, but they're different from each other. The Sunnis have always ruled Iraq under the Ottomans, under the British, between the two wars, and under Saddam Hussein, who had a government made up of Tikritis from his own village. His family members were at the very top, his Tikritis and so forth. The Ba'ath Party was dominated by Sunnis as well as the military. America turned Iraq upside down. It took the Sunnis from the top of society and cast them down to the bottom, and catapulted the Shiites from the bottom of society to the top. And the government today is dominated by Shiites. In Iraq, the militias are Shiite, the army is dominated by Shiites. And the Ba'ath Party was made illegal, and the Syrian army under the Americans the Iraqi army was disbanded, which caused this giant insurgency, because the Sunnis thought, oh my God, this can't be happening to us. America's evil. They've come here to destroy everything we know and to put us at the bottom of the system. So they fought like men. And they fought against the Shiites who were catapulted. And a civil war was messy, as we know. First, Al-Qaeda. The Sunnis joined Al-Qaeda in big numbers because they thought Al-Qaeda would save them. And then they joined ISIS in big numbers because they thought ISIS could save them from the Shiites. America had to destroy and bomb Iraq both times, massively, in order to destroy those two insurgencies and to consolidate Shiites. But it was very expensive. In Syria, this is a little map, 2015, when ISIS had reached its apogee, its largest extent, ruling in the black area in the middle of Syria and Iraq. Thus, the Sunni part of Iraq, which fell with almost no gunshots to ISIS when it marched in the summer of 2014, and swept through the Sunni parts of Iraq, because the Sunnis were so alienated by the Shiite government. It felt so persecuted. They saw ISIS as a better alternative to the government that America had created. Something similar is going to happen in Syria. And so you get this big ISIS state, which is really, in a sense, a Sunni nation, a Boren, in order not to live with the Shiites. Shiites in Iraq, but also it's Shiite-dominated government in Syria, because the Alawites are going to dominate, as we're going to see, in Syria. And America couldn't stand this caliphate and needed to destroy it. We turned to the international borders. In almost all the cases, whether it's from Poland or right down, the borders are not changed hugely in these new states. The people are changed to fit the borders, hence the big ethnic cleansing. But the borders become sacrosanct in international law. Yugoslavia is, in a sense, an exception that fits the rule, because Yugoslavia was chopped up into 7 different nation states. And the international community tried to solve Yugoslavia by chopping the 7. And whether that was the best solution or not, I leave to my ex-Yugoslavs to discuss at some point. But all the other states, whether it's Poland or Hungary or Czechoslovakia, so forth, have largely been kept. Now, Czechoslovakia managed to split near Velvet Revolution and made Czechs Slovak. But the others, Poland was 64% Polish before. By 1950, it was 100% Polish. 3 million Jews killed, the Germans all driven out, the Ukrainians driven out. Same things are happening right down Central Europe, and they're in a sense happening in the Middle East today. The Middle East is caught in this nation-building process. So America, by swooping in to Iraq, thinking, oh, we're going to create democracy, it kicks off this tyrannical government, which is acting a little bit like the Ottoman Sultan, because it is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious little empire that Saddam Hussein was ruled. And he ruled it with a Qurban. He ruled it with very, particularly because he's a minority. But by taking him off, you don't solve the problem. You just kindle this terrible civil war. And the same thing is going to happen in Syria. In Syria, you have an ethnic distribution that's different, but it's sort of the opposite of what was in Iraq. That green part there are Alawites. 12% of the Syrian population are Alawites. They are a Shiite, heterodox Shiite sect. 70% of Syrians are Sunni Arab. And 10% up there at the top are Kurds. Different. There are other minorities, we're not going to talk about them. But the Alawites are important because France, which occupied Syria from World War I to the end of World War II, did a divide and conquer, and used the Alawites, over-recruited them into the army, and used them to put down the Sunni Arab nationalists who were rebelling against the French. So when the French left in 1946, Alawite officers and soldiers and junior officers were big in the military, and they were able to carry out coups and consolidate their power in the 1960s or 70s in Syria. And they took power and ruled with a rather fierce security state, just the way the Sunnis were ruling in Iraq. In 2011, with the Arab Spring, the Syrians revolt against their government, which is despotic. All Syrians wanted reform. The government was corrupt. People would disappear in prison. Once war started, the country split along sectarian lines. The religious minorities, Christians, were about 5-6% in Syria. The Druze, that little blue part down at the bottom, the Alawites, stuck together because they feared the Sunni Muslims would persecute them religiously if they came to power, that they would be Islamist and they would be pushed to the margins. So the minorities stuck together, and the Alawites, of course, had Russian and Iranian backing. The Sunnis were the vast majority. But if you take Lebanon, Syria, Iraq as three countries together, and if you were to join them all together, there are more Shiite Arabs than there are Sunni Arabs in the three countries together. And that's what saved the Assad regime. Because even though he was a minority of the Shiites in Syria, he could count on Hezbollah coming over and helping him, a very powerful Shiite militia from Lebanon, and Ahl al-Haq and other militias from Iraq that came over and helped him as well, Shiite militias. And Iran was helping as well. So that created this fight for who's going to rule. And Syria and the Alawites stood. Now, why did they survive? Why did they survive at the top of Syria? They survived because America didn't know what to do in Syria. President Obama in 2011, right almost at the beginning of the uprising, said Assad has to go. He thought Assad was going to collapse almost immediately. Flint Leverett and I were both naysayers in this in 2011. But almost everybody in the CIA thought Assad was going to fall. It just did a matter of 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. And so President Obama said he's got to leave, thinking he was on the right side of history. The problem is that very quickly, amongst the rebels, which were Sunni Arabs, Al-Qaeda began to gain purchase because it came over from Iraq, the organized group, which had been largely suppressed in Iraq and was hiding, but they were there, they were organized, they learned how to fight against the Americans in Iraq, and they spread their organization. A guy named named Ujolani, who was a right-hand man of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the caliph, who later became the caliph of ISIS, was sent to Syria. He was a Syrian. He was sent. He had fought the Americans in Iraq. He was sent to Syria to create an al-Qaeda. And he did very successfully. So here's the deputy director of the CIA giving an interview September 2013, and he lays out the American dilemma, which is al-Qaeda has become the dominant force. The Islamist groups within the Syrian opposition, and there were 1,500 separate militias in Syria. So every village had its own militia. But al-Qaeda was by far the biggest, and the CIA recognized it. And the CIA was pumping arms into the Sunni rebels in order to kill the Alawites and the Syrian army. But he didn't want the Syrian army to collapse, because he didn't want a replica of what happened in Iraq, where you don't have an army and the country just turns into chaos and might split apart, and al-Qaeda could dominate, could come to Damascus and take over the capital. So he says the U.S. needs to encourage Assad to step aside, but without destroying the Syrian army. So he's in a dilemma. And I'm sure the CIA was told to do this by President Obama. Get rid of Assad, but don't destroy the Syrian army. The problem is it showed an incredible lack of understanding for Syrian realities. The top 40 generals in the Syrian army were all Alawite. They had been chosen by Assad and Alawite because of their loyalty. They were not going to separate from him. They understood full well that if they overthrew the president and began fighting amongst themselves for leadership, they were going to be finished. They had to stick together. So they weren't going to just turn to the United States and say, yeah, we'll get rid of our president, leader, and you tell us what to do. So Burrell explained, and here these are quotes from his interview. The Syrian military and the institution of the Syrian security services are required to defeat al-Qaeda when this is done. So he wants to, but he says the problem is that Assad still believes that he's in a dominant position, that he can win. Therefore, we have to give more arms to the rebels, weaken the Syrian army until they're so weak that they come to America and they say, save us. Then America will say, get rid of Assad and we'll save you. Then we'll build you up and you can kill the rebels in al-Qaeda that we've just been funding. It's mind-bending. It's perplexing. How are they going to pull off this sneaky move? They're not going to pull it off, is the answer. But that's their strategy. Already in 2013, that's the strategy. And it gets worse. Because by 2015, ISIS has grown up and become even more powerful than al-Qaeda. And the CIA, here's the headline from Times of Israel. CIA chief Brennan says U.S. does not want to see Assad fall. He goes, extremist elements, including the IS, Islamic State, and al-Qaeda, are ascending right now. That's why it's important to bolster those forces within the Syrian opposition that are not extremists, which they couldn't find. And none of us, and he goes on, none of us, Russia, the United States, the coalition partners, the regional states, the other Arab states, none of us wants to see the collapse of the government. And they don't want to see ISIS take Damascus. So here is America talking with Russia. This is in March 2015. Russia enters into Syria with their air force to help Assad bolster his troops in September. But clearly, the Americans and the Russians are talking, and they've decided we don't want Assad to fall. ISIS is getting too powerful. And you can see here is the map of what ISIS looked like in 2015 when Brennan made this statement. And ISIS is stretching right down to Damascus, those black little pointers. ISIS has been conquering territory right up to the suburbs of Damascus. And if they had taken Damascus, a city of 5 million people, it would have been a disaster. Look what we had to do to Iraqi cities and to Raqqa in order to get ISIS out of them. We just had to level those cities. Mosul in Iraq, harsher. So had this happened in Damascus, a tragedy. And this is Kerry. He was caught talking to the Syrian opposition at the UN. I think it was in Sweden's office. There were about 30 or 40 opposition members, Syrian opposition members, and they were berating him. Why didn't you help us overthrow Assad? And he says, if somebody's recording it on their Apple phone and they put it right up on YouTube afterwards, so we have this beautifully in Testament. And he says, we saw that ISIS was getting closer to Damascus. We were watching. We thought that we could manage. Now, he just stops there because he realizes he's getting into a little trouble. But what he's saying is, we were, in a sense, using ISIS. Not that America was arming ISIS or anything, but we were watching them as the hammer that was going to make the Syrian army come to us. Because before they fell, they were going to come to America and beg for help. We were watching. We thought we could manage, that we could negotiate. Instead, Assad got the Russians. We thought that the Assad would come to us, but he asked the Russians instead. Now, you have to ask him. He is sitting in front of a room, like you guys, of Syrian opposition members who are all pissed off because they've been abandoned by America. So he's got to tell them something. So maybe this isn't completely true, but it's not completely false either. It's most likely, to answer your previous question, that the Americans sat down with the Russians and said, we can't let ISIS in. But what America did is it sided with the Kurds up in the north to destroy ISIS. It abandoned the Syrian opposition, the Sunni Arabs, and switched horses to the Kurds. And that's where we are today. And we armed up the Kurds, Syrian Democratic Forces, which are now trained, paid for by the United States, in order to destroy ISIS. And Russia stepped in on the side of Bashar al-Assad and sent his airplanes in to destroy al-Qaeda, which was in the western part of Syria, and all the other opposition forces. Then to save Assad, then to restore him to power. So yes, Russia did save him. Iran helped save him too. But it was really America's decision. Because America could have overthrown Assad in a flash. The Syrian army was so weak. If it had given a few Stinger missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, to the Syrian opposition, they could have shot down these Russian MiGs. And they could have helped this opposition overthrow Assad, which is what they wanted. But if that would have meant that ISIS and al-Qaeda took over. And so America said, no, we're going to save this. But the problem is, you don't like Assad because he's with Iran and Russia. And our envoy to James Jeffrey, our envoy to Syria under President Trump, but he's a career State Department guy, he's been ambassador to Turkey and other places. He said, my job is to make Syria a quagmire for the Russians and Iranians. So what he said about doing was trying to divide Syria. And Syria today is divided into 3 sections. So let me push this light, if I can do it. Here's a light. It's divided into 3 sections. The government, with Russian help, was able to reconquer all the orange parts. America took everything north of the Euphrates, and they called it deep infliction. So American planes fly over this area, Russian planes have this area, and America and Russia agreed that the Euphrates would be the deconfliction line, and they would partition. Assad and the Russians drove all of the Syrian opposition groups that had conquered lots of this area back up into this small enclave in Idlib province in north Aleppo. That's where they live today. And Turkey provides for them and has a police force in there and protects them from the Syrian Air Force. So Turkey really owns this area with Sunni Arab militias. America owns this area with Kurdish-dominated militia, Syrian Defense Forces, Democratic Forces, excuse me, and Assad owns this area with the Syrian army and Russian-backed, Iranian-backed. So Syria is very weak. Almost all of Syria's oil and much of its agricultural land is in the American zone. So it's very cheap for America to stay here and fund the Kurdish militia from Syria's oil. The rest of Syria is very, very poor. And there are very strict sanctions on Syria. So America has managed to turn Syria into an extremely poor and broken country, which serves America's interests. Because, as James Jeffrey said, Washington's fallback position is to maintain a stalemate that denies Iran and Russia a strategic victory in Syria. So it keeps Syria a broken country and very poor. 90% of Syrians live under the poverty line today. They get about an hour. My wife was Syrian and her parents, brother and so forth, all live in Syria, and they get about an hour or two of electricity a day. They don't have a refrigerator, so their food goes bad all the time. They have to go to the butcher shop at a certain time of day to get chicken before it rots, because the butcher can't keep everything refrigerated. And there's not enough kerosene and others to run generators, produce all this electricity. Anyway, it's a bad situation, but it shows what has happened to regime change. Libya is still in the middle of a civil war, divided with different militias right in the south. Iraq is in a very bad state. There's been over 6 million Syrians flee the country. About 6 million have been displaced within Syria, their homes. So it was a country of 22 million people when the war started, and it's broken down. But that's the result of these interventions. And what has America gotten? The question then is, what has America gotten out of regime change? If you look at the costs based on this Brown University war project, the deaths of Iraqis in Afghanistan since 2001 are estimated to be about 900,000. Now, it's not only ones who died by being shot or blown up. That's also those that died because of the collapse of the medical system, because there's no medicine, bad water, disease, because the country collapses in the middle of the Civil War and people can't take care of themselves. And that's demographers have looked at the population growth and its trajectory, if you follow what it should be based on pre-Civil War and where it is today. They come up with these numbers. In Iraq, some 300,000 Iraqi civilians were killed by direct violence since the U.S. invasion. Now that includes the Civil War. So it's Iraqis fighting each other, too. It's not just Americans pulling the trigger. But it's a lot of death. 8 million refugees between Afghanistan, probably a lot more than that. But there were 4 million Iraqi refugees at the height of the Civil War. Cost of the two wars estimated at $8 trillion to America. $8 trillion. What is our debt today?
34 trillion.
34 trillion. 8 trillion is a big hunk of that 34 trillion. It has put a big burden on every American. And what do we get out of it? Do we have an embassy in Afghanistan? No. We do have an embassy in Iraq, which Noor worked in for a number of years, but we have very little influence in Iraq. Iraq leans towards Iran, and nothing came out the way America wanted. In Syria, we have a broken country which has poverty and is producing tons of refugees, which are a big burden on neighboring states like Jordan, where there's 1.5 million, Lebanon, there's 1.5 million, Turkey, where there's 4 million refugees, and Europe swallowed a lot of Syrian refugees and Afghan refugees, which caused Europe to sway right and become much more populist because of all of this refugee flow. So, anyway, to sum up on the regime change part, and to end this as quickly as I can, it was bad policy. America got carried away because they could, because they thought they could remake the Middle East in their own image. And it led them to really overreach. And of course, it hasn't hurt America that much because we're so big and so powerful. But it's not, at any rate, we won't moralize. Let me turn to the terrorist relief. And I'm going to use an example here of a relationship where, as we've seen in the last year, America has become very weak in the face of Prime Minister Netanyahu's policy, which has led America into engagements in Lebanon, Gaza, now Iran, which he doesn't really want to be in. But the president's had minimal ability to get a ceasefire, to restrain Israel from Lebanon. Why? There are shared values with Israel. There is an Israeli lobby. There is a legal agreement with Israel, which was the qualitative military edge in which America guarantees Israel that it can defeat any combination of Arab countries at once. That means we cannot sell F-35s to Arab countries. We can do supply them to Israel. All of our top missile technology, etc. Religion. There are a number of reasons why we support Israel. But it's led to overreach. And I want to use an example of how this comes about. And I'm going to use 1973 and the Nixon presidency. In 1967, Israel conquered lots of territory. It invaded Egypt, Syria, Jordan. It took the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights up there in the north from Syria. President Johnson agreed that Israel could keep those territories for future land for peace. UN Resolution 242 was about land for peace. Israel would give all this land back if their neighboring countries made peace. But in 73 war, both Syria and Egypt surprise attack Israel in an effort to get back their occupied territory. The Golan Heights for Syria, Sinai Peninsula for Egypt. Assad of Syria, after the first day, he had been very successful, surprising the Israelis, and had conquered up to the edge of the Golan Heights, this big, high area, mountainous area. And he got in touch with the Russians, and he asked for a truce, that the Russians intervene with America and stop the war. We've won what we want. Now, Israel's going to turn that around and march all the way to Damascus, right at the gates of Damascus, by the end of the war. But President Nixon was left with a dilemma in 73, which was, he told Kissinger that the United States must come out of the war with a permanent settlement to the Arab-Israeli conflict. He would not tolerate, he said, there's a quote from his telephone call, having this thing hanging over our heads for another 4 years and have us at odds with the Arab world. We're not going to do it anymore, he said. he believed that the flaw in Johnson's decision to accept the outcome of the Six-Day War was clear, because Israel wanted to keep the territories that it had conquered, and the Arabs were convinced that it was a land grab. They were never going to get their land back. Sadat, when he came to power, Egyptian president, in 1970, after Nasser died, tried to rekindle peace talks with Israel, say, land for peace, give me back Sinai, I'll give you peace. Israel wouldn't pick up the phone. Why? Because they had the beautiful Sinai Peninsula, which is gorgeous. They'd already started putting settlers there, and they'd built hotels along the Red Sea, and all young Israelis would go for their spring break down to the Sinai and go snorkeling and see the beautiful reefs. It was nice, like Florida. So Israel didn't want to give it back. Why would they? They beat the Arabs so easily. I can't tell you how many confabulations at the Council of Foreign Relations I went to, the Israeli intelligence people and so forth. We would play this little mock role, and I was always brought in to play the Syrian outweight. And we would say, and I would say, give us back the Golan, you'll have peace, we can help you with Hezbollah and other things like that. And the Israelis would sit there, they would say, why do we want an Israeli flag flying over an embassy in Damascus for the entire Golan Heights? We've had peace for 30 years with Syria. Syria hasn't hurt us. Syria's weak. We'd much prefer having the Golan Heights, which gives us security and a beautiful place to grow grapes and wine and skiing and so forth. Why would we want that? Because it was too easy, right? Because you can. It gets back to that same problem, because you can keep it. And so Nixon was determined not to let this happen again. He wanted to use the 73 war to get Israel to cough up the occupying territories, return it to the Arabs, and be seen as the heroic American justice bringer who's going to bring stability and peace to the Middle East. The Colby, the head of the CIA, said Israel was holding its own on the Egyptian and Syrian fronts. The war's development suggested a prudent strategy of restraint and a call for a ceasefire was what America should do. Restrain, don't get it too much involved, and let Israel suffer a little bit. They're going to do fine. This would suggest the Israelis that holding on to these conquered territories was no longer in their interest, because it would hurt their security. The question was how to calibrate the American resupply of munitions to limit the war and force the Israelis to reconsider whether the conquest of '67 had brought them additional security. Nixon dictated that there would be no large-scale airlift of tanks, airplanes as heavy weapons to Israel. He would replace the tanks, the planes that they lost in the war at the end of the war. He was going to give them ammunition and other stuff discreetly, but not heavy tanks in airplanes. Israeli envoys urged friends in the Senate, Javits, Ribikoff, Humphreys, Huntington, Henry Jackson, and claimed we need a massive arms resupply, and began to pressure Nixon. Newspaper stories questioned Nixon's support for Israel. Senator Jackson threatened Nixon with a congressional investigation, and Nixon was extraordinarily weak because he could better do it. And didn't need it, and no more trouble with Congress. He caved. He abandoned his strategy of not doing a big civil resupply, letting Israel not reconquer all the territory, or making it very difficult to conquer the territory. And then, so overnight, he switched. He said, okay, major resupply. It became very popular in America. He sent hundreds of tanks, airplanes, and so forth to Israel in big carrier airplanes. And this turned the war around, and you see a little map of what Israel was able to do in very short order is reconquer all this, reconquer, push the Egyptians back, go across the Suez, and take on Yellen part there. And they conquered beyond the Golan Heights. They took the Golan Heights back and they went up to the gates of Damascus and threatened the Syrian regime. And Israel came out very well and didn't want to trade land for peace. And America was stuck then in this boiling Middle East that hadn't resolved its territorial disputes, where the neighboring countries were angry, and this pattern of caving in to Congress on the part of presidents and not being able to solve the land disputes. President Carter came along and pressured Israel to give up Sinai to New Jersey. And he got that deal done. He originally wanted to have a comprehensive peace with the UN and get Syrian and Palestinian state. He couldn't do it at the end. Begin refused to consider giving back the West Bank, East Jerusalem, to Golan Heights. But he was willing to give back the Sinai Peninsula, and Carter took it because it was better than nothing. But for Israel, that got rid of Egypt out of the equation, the biggest Arab bloc. And Israeli prime ministers understood that the Syrian army, the Jordanian army, were just no match for Israel, and that they could keep the rest of the territory. And Begin annexed then a large in Jerusalem, annexed the Golan Heights, and began to move more and more settlers into the West Bank. They had already begun to move to the West Bank, but today you've got 700,000 settlers in the West Bank. This kidney-shaped area right here, which should, or is supposed to have been, a Palestinian state in the Oslo Accords and so forth. But today, it's inhabited by 700,000 Israelis. It's 1 out of every 10 Israelis who live in the occupied territory that, if you're going to have a two-state solution, would go to the Palestinians. And President Biden said at the beginning of the Gaza war, we cannot return to the status quo. We have to have a two-state solution. Now, Netanyahu does not want a two-state solution. That's what his life's energy has been spent trying to make over Israel. And he has defied President in that. And he is going to use military force to try to destroy this axis of resistance that has grown up around those countries that have continuing disputes with Israel: Syria, Lebanon, Iran. Iran is, of course, exploiting this sense of injustice on the part of the neighboring states and the Palestinians. It exploits it for its own strategic reasons in the Middle East. But the way to denature that exploitation is to come to an understanding with the Palestinians. Because were there an understanding with the Palestinians, Iran would have no purchase over this resistance axis. There would be Iranian influence because of the Shia-Sunni struggle, but it wouldn't be, Israel couldn't be denatured, in theory, rather than trying to destroy them all. And that's the policy that America has launched out on, and is talking about a new Middle East with a new Lebanon and a new Lebanese government, and these are opportunities of borning by hammering these different neighboring countries. And I fear that it isn't going to be a new government that's a better government. It's only going to bring, create more property and more anger in the region. So, in conclusion, overreach, because America can't, because Israel can. And our special relationship with Israel has tied us into, just as we're trying to pivot to Asia, concentrate on China. We have 50,000 troops in the Middle East, spending a lot of money to really tangled up in these thorny issues that America shouldn't be involved in, doesn't need to be involved in. spending billions of dollars to deal with. And that's, those are the three takeaways, I think, from America in the Middle East. They were my top three takeaways, is overreach from using too much intervention, the idea of regime change, and we're getting ourselves into another complicated zone by not being able to distance ourselves from Israel or reining in Netanyahu's ambitions and his ability to use really overwhelming military force, which is, of course, American supply for this, to arrange his relationships with the neighbor. Thank you. Yes?
You keep calling it overreach, but I think it's hubris.
Hubris is a good word for it.
And this could actually result in the collapse of America.
Well, it's certainly hastening our debt, and it's certainly undermined the rules-based order that America holds on. And it's made, I think, a lot of American allies question American leadership.
I mean, parallels between what's happening to us and what happened in Rome are very similar.
I'm sure there are many parallels. Yes, sir.
Are there, you had mentioned the World War I countries, all of them kind of fail. Are there conditions, or do folks like you work on sort of conditions where countries succeed? Well, there's a list, and then conditions where the idea of the country itself, and the conditions where they just don't match up, and you're not going to get a country. And so if your conditions of a country don't exist, then the question would seem to be, okay, so what kind of governance can be peaceful?
Well, let me,
It's
it's a good question. It's a good question, and I'm going to try to answer it very quickly, which is that all nation states are created out of lots of disparate people. If we take, Eugene Weber wrote a beautiful book, UCLA guy, called Peasants of Differential. And he comes out with 1880 as the year that more than 50% of French people could understand Parisian French. Because before that time, they were speaking Bretagne or Normand or Basque or Alsatian, or they were speaking lots of different dialects and different languages. Catalan, you name it. They couldn't understand Parisian. But those nations are made because of long duration, and maybe we should make everybody do dictation on Friday and have the blue letters, the little red letters. But this central government that is overbearing, the Louis XIV, l'État c'est moi, are pressing down and turning these disparate people into a nation state. And the more stability you have, the less violence it's going to take. Now, when I said they fail, of course, Poland is still there, so is Hungary and so forth. The trouble is they just don't have any Jews, they don't have any minorities. They've ethnically cleansed the people that should have been somehow brought into the polity. How do you do that? Very difficult. I mean, look at the United States, had to go through, kill the Native Americans, put them in reservations, Civil War, Black Americans, slavery. It's not been a joyride, especially if you're a minority. I guess my folks had a pretty good time. But nation building is tough everywhere. I don't mean they failed, but they failed to do it peaceably without a lot of ethnic cleansing. And I think every nation's had. We forget that the European nations have gone through that because it was a few hundred years ago. These other newer countries, it's much more recent, so we see it doing that. That's a long answer to your question.
Yeah, it's a hard.
All right. Well, it's the appointed hour, and SIA would like to say thank you once again, and a few memorials.
Well, thank you very much. I look forward to this.
But